Welcome to Until All of Us Are Free, a year-long multimedia education project dedicated to Black liberation as collective liberation. I am your host and creator of this project, Ijoma Oluo. We'll be moving on to our April focus on Black liberation and the exploitation of Africa next week. But this week, we're going to finish our March Collective Liberation 101 focus with a discussion on boycotts and strikes. Boycotts and strikes have been an important part of resistance work for millennia, with the first recorded strike occurring in ancient Egypt. Boycotts and strikes have also been vital to liberation struggles throughout the history of the United States. And in the last year and a half, with the U.S. government's support of genocide in Palestine, and with the rise in fascism in our own governments, there have been increased calls for boycotts and strikes. And while some of these boycotts and strikes have been effective, I'm looking at you, Starbucks, many have not. Many have left people feeling confused and frustrated. So let's talk about what boycotts and strikes are, and how they have been and can be effective tools for resistance and revolution. Let's talk about what has made them effective in the past, and why we might struggle with them today. First, let's talk about what boycotts and strikes are. Let's start with boycotts. Boycotts are a choice to avoid spending money or patronizing businesses, events, even entire regions of state as a form of protest. These can be personal or cooperative, small, local, widespread, national, and even international. The goal of boycotts is to put economic, social, or political pressure on specific entities. An example of a successful boycott in our history is the Montgomery bus boycott, which we will discuss a little bit more in just a few minutes. Boycotts can also be a part of a larger movement called BDS, Boycott, Divest, and Sanction, and these often target entire states. BDS was a very successful part of protest against the South African apartheid government that many people all over the world and entire cities and countries joined in order to pressure the South African government to get rid of its apartheid laws. There have been long-standing BDS efforts against the Israeli government and its apartheid in Palestine. Boycott, divest, and sanction is usually well organized and has three components: boycott, divest, sanction. So it is strategically chosen entities to boycott, entities to divest from, pull money from, and encourage other entities to pull their money from, and sanctions. Let's talk about strikes. First, let's talk about a labor strike. Those are the ones that people are most familiar with. A labor strike is the withholding of labor in order to accomplish specific goals, usually with an employer or an industry. The goal is to put economic pressure on that specific employer or on that specific entity in order to accomplish goals, usually related to labor rights. There are other strikes than just labor strikes. Students have been known to strike. Also, hunger strikes are a form of protest as well. The refusal to work in order to force change in a workplace has been a powerful tool of labor rights for millennia. Strikes have been very important in our history, especially in hard labor jobs, in mines and factories, where workers' physical safety has often been placed at risk by greedy employers. Strikes have been essential to our labor rights movement and for the creation of a lot of the labor rights that we enjoy today. And because of that, the right to strike has been regularly under attack by our government. Now let's talk about general strikes. We've been hearing a lot about general strikes lately, especially on social media. General strikes are a ceasing or drastic reduction of all economic activity. So that not only includes labor, it also includes spending. In general strikes, often people call in sick from work or don't go into work. People stop spending money, especially with larger corporations. And sometimes people also refuse to pay taxes. So why are boycotts and strikes such a long-standing tool of resistance? Well, they can be really powerful. Boycotts and strikes are both fundamentally about taking back our economic power. The truth is that in our economic system, most of what we think of as economic power isn't real. The financial power that these corporations have relies upon our labor and our spending. The stock market is all speculation on how much labor they can extract from us and how much we will spend. And so even though these entities seem to have amassed a large amount of social, political, and economic power, the only power that truly exists that we can hold in our hands is our economic power. Our power to withhold our labor, use our labor, and withhold our patronage. That is why true effective strikes and boycotts are considered an act of war by many oppressive states and corporations. Capitalism needs our labor and our money to function. So even though they try to use this manufactured power over us, our power is the real power. And they definitely don't want us to know that. So let's take a look at what happens when boycotts and strikes are effective. And just to let you know, in the episode notes for this episode, I have a lot more information and resources, including a handy printable document that gives some tips around this. So be sure to check those out at untilwearefree.com. You don't want to miss out. Let's take a look at the Montgomery bus boycott as an example of a very effective boycott. From December 5th, 1955 to December 20th, 1956, Black people in Montgomery, Alabama widely boycotted the public bus system. This was in protest of busing segregation. There were a lot of rules that discriminated against Black passengers. Black passengers were required to move to the back of the bus to make room for white passengers. They were often mistreated by bus drivers, even to the point of being left standing after they paid their fare when bus drivers drove off without them. Also, Black people were not allowed to be bus drivers. After Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger, the Montgomery bus boycott started. And a little over a year later, the Supreme Court decided that the bus segregation in Montgomery was unconstitutional, effectively ending the boycott. This has been seen by many as the start of the civil rights movement in the United States. So let's talk a little bit more about what made this boycott so effective. First, it was strategic. It wasn't coincidence that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, that Rosa Parks was arrested, and that it led to protest. Rosa Parks was one of a few people chosen to refuse to give up their seats. And the response that the community would have when Rosa Parks was arrested had already been worked out by organizers in advance. Organizers also knew that the Montgomery bus system heavily relied on Black patronage, even as they actively discriminated against Black passengers. They knew that their protest would be effective, that it would be financially devastating to that industry. This boycott was highly cooperative. Multiple groups cooperated on the planning and execution of this boycott, including the NAACP and the Women's Political Council, along with many other Black community and activist groups. Even though many people associate Dr. King with this boycott, and many people think of him as the organizer around this, the truth is that Dr. King was actually brought in after a lot of the groundwork was already laid and strategically chosen as a figurehead of this widely cooperative movement. Next, organizers were prepared to support boycotters for the long term. Remember, this boycott lasted over a year. For over a year, Black people in Montgomery chose to forego a vital service that normally would get them to work, get them to the store, get them around community. In order to make sure that this boycott could last, people took shifts on picket lines. People made food and gathered resources for protesters and picketers. Black taxi drivers lowered their fares to match bus fares so that Black passengers could still afford to get to work. And when the Montgomery government started fining Black taxi drivers for reducing their fares, Black community members then took up collections to buy new shoes, bicycles, and other forms of transportation for Black people in Montgomery. People carpooled, they rode bikes, they even took horse and buggy to work. It's also important to note that this boycott was grounded in community and affirmed by community. Community met up regularly through this boycott, shared resources through this boycott, and regularly talked about and reaffirmed their goals as a community. And that can really help keep you going through these longer actions. Now, let's talk about how we view this boycott as a success. Because for a lot of people, we view this as a success because bus segregation was outlawed. But that wasn't actually the primary success of this. The truth is that even though on paper bus segregation was made illegal, once the boycott ended, most bus operators returned to practice as normal, and the buses were still effectively segregated. So what made this a success? Well, it made it a success because it brought massive amounts of people to the civil rights movement. Not only that, but it taught them how to resist, taught them how to protest, how to build community, and how to make that protest sustainable. It also brought a lot of nationwide attention to the fight for civil rights. Strikes and boycotts can be incredibly effective. And when they are, they often have some things in common. They are strategic. They are very rarely spur of the moment, even if it may seem like they are at the time. There are usually organizing groups planning for particular contingencies of when they will go into strike or launch a boycott. This means that the goal you have for that strike or boycott is already pre-decided. Your networks are already built, or at least starting to be built. You already know what your messaging will be. Boycotts and strikes that are effective are usually cooperative. It's very rare that one small group of people are able to do this alone. Usually you need broader community support, or you need to be able to coordinate with other impacted groups to really maximize the impact of your strike or boycott. This also means pooling resources and caring for each other. Effective strikes and boycotts are usually easy to follow, join, and maintain. That means your messaging has to be really clear. Your goals have to be simple and laid out and understandable. It also means that we have to consider the impact of the strike or boycott on community. If the burden we're placing on particular people already oppressed is too high and we don't offer any care or any alternatives, it won't be sustainable. Think about a general strike, asking people to stop spending money, to stop going to work. How are people going to pay rent? What about the impact on independent businesses in our own community? What about those essentials that maybe you weren't prepared to already have in your home? Preparing for all of that in advance increases the chance of that strike being something that people can join and maintain. Effective strikes and boycotts usually have clear messaging, clear demands, and a clear sense of shared goal. If people don't know why they're joining and what it will mean to them or their community, they're just not going to join, or they won't last long. And finally, where strikes and boycotts are most effective, they usually target areas where the population that is striking or boycotting knows they have an increased ability to impact oppressors. So boycotting a company where your community doesn't normally spend money isn't going to be effective. Going on strike where you don't have the worker population, or that population that is striking doesn't make a huge financial impact on that company or industry, isn't going to be very effective. So looking really at where you're spending your money, where your economic impact will be felt, and really focusing your protest there will increase the effectiveness of your strike or boycott. The reason why the Montgomery bus boycott was so effective was because of how many Black people needed to ride the bus to get to work. If it had only been a small percentage of the bus patronage that was Black, it wouldn't have been an effective protest. So why do we often struggle so much with strikes and boycotts today? Well, first, let's talk about the government, because the truth is that in recent decades, the government has put a lot of work into decreasing our ability to effectively strike or boycott. Unions have been under attack by different legislatures for decades. Unions have been weakened through laws that reduce the amount of money they get and reduce their ability to protest and organize. Not only have unions been attacked, but our general right to protest has been attacked, and increasing amounts of industries and jobs have been made exempt from legal protections that strikers have for a long time enjoyed. And many states in the US and governments around the world have made BDS efforts illegal, especially when they target the Israeli government's oppression of the Palestinian people. So looking at that, we already do have a lot against us when we're trying to organize. But we don't do ourselves any favors when we are unclear in our messaging, when we contradict ourselves. And if you look online around strikes or boycotts, you can see it clearly. You'll see 20 different posters for a single strike or a single boycott, and the messaging will be different on everyone, the goals will be different on everyone, and even the directions of how to follow along with that strike or boycott will be different on everyone. Very little time or care is taken to explaining how to strike or how to boycott, or what the purpose of the strike or the boycott is. And often, we don't consider the broader impact on populations that will be participating in this boycott or strike. If we're asking people to abstain from spending money for a particular period of time, where is it good for them to spend their money? Or how can they support small businesses in their community who would be devastatingly impacted by that withdrawal of funds? Are we just asking people to postpone spending all of their money for a day? Or are we asking them to make strategic shifts in how they spend money to more permanently pull money away from oppressive entities? These are all things we have to consider if we're going to have effective strikes and boycotts. And finally, often the method doesn't match the political goal. Let's talk about that. Boycotts are often used to pressure a specific entity or corporation in order to pressure them to make change, or to make an example of them that goes across an entire industry. Where boycotts have been effective, as many would say the Starbucks boycott has, they are that focused and they have very clear goals. There's a couple of goals around the Starbucks one. One around allowing the workers at Starbucks to be able to unionize, and two, to get Starbucks to divest from the genocide in Palestine. Now, being effective doesn't mean that it's accomplished all their goals, but we have been seeing a shift in how Starbucks has been addressing labor, and we've also seen a long-term sustained reduction in revenue to that corporation, which means it's something that people understand how to participate in and can maintain. Labor strikes usually have specific demands for a particular employer or industry. Usually those demands are related to labor itself, labor protections, or pay and compensation. But they can also be connected to broader political goals. Say you work for a corporation that is supporting a fascist state. You can go on a labor strike to try to force the corporation that you work for to withdraw its support of that oppressive state. Both boycotts and labor strikes are specific forms of protests that assume a long-term continued relationship between the strikers or boycotters and the entity in order to be effective. If you have a labor strike and everyone who's striking says they're never going to go back to work in that space no matter what, then it's not effective. And that corporation simply will seek new employees. If you are boycotting a corporation or a business and you say, no matter what, I will never patronize this space again, then you just cease being a customer for that entity and you lose your actual bargaining tools. General strikes are a bit different. General strikes are considered by many to be more revolutionary. They're considered by many to be a way to withdraw your participation from oppressive states. The goal of this isn't necessarily to get a particular outcome from an entity. It is actually to destabilize that entity. General strikes are usually about removing our participation from state oppressors and capitalist oppressors and reclaiming our power and focusing it more on our communities and building alternatives to those oppressive powers. In many states where general strikes have been used, they have been seen as an act of war by the state or by the entities that they target. They take a lot of support and commitment to truly radical change. Many more radical organizers have seen labor strikes and boycotts not as tools of revolutionary change, but as teachers for more long-term resistance. If we look at the Montgomery bus boycott again, the impact that is often in history books, which is making bus segregation illegal, wasn't actually the most powerful accomplishment, right? It was the education it brought. It was the people it brought to the movements. And for many more radical organizers, that is often the most that we have to look for from labor strikes and boycotts. They are a way of introducing people to organizing and resistance works, to building important networks, to learning how to strategize, how to support each other, and how to build tolerance to long-term resistance. They're also a great way to give people first-hand experience with working against fascist and oppressive systems. It provides an education about how these systems work and what we're up against that you simply can't find in books alone. So for me, when I'm looking at all of these calls for general strikes that don't seem to be incredibly effective, it seems pretty easy to see why. The truth is that in the United States, especially with all of the effort that the state has put into discouraging people from striking and boycotting, we don't have that basic level of experience or knowledge in how to build these effectively and maintain them. And it doesn't mean we can't do it, but I do think that we may want to consider starting smaller. It might be good to consider how we are going to get people to participate and to understand how boycotts and strikes work, to make them accessible and able to be effectively put into place. How large do you want to start? What are your short, medium, and long-term goals? These are all things we have to consider if we want strikes and boycotts to be an effective part of our resistance work. And I hope these are things that we will consider, because these can be the most powerful tools that we have to fight oppressive states. For more complete information on things to consider, for a reading list and more tools to learn more about boycotts and strikes, be sure to check out the episode notes at untilwearefree.com. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Until All of Us Are Free, a year-long multimedia education project dedicated to Black liberation as collective liberation. I am your host and creator of this project, Ijoma Oluwo. You can find the important episode notes for this episode at untilwearefree.com. You can also find past episodes there. That is also where you can sign up to be a paid supporter of this project. This project is purely self and supporter funded, and I want to keep it as accessible as possible. No one is charged to access this material that I'm putting together here, but your support can ensure that I can make this the best quality material that I can. Thank you for joining me this week, and be sure to sign up at untilwearefree.com so you don't miss out on next week's episode when we discuss Black liberation and the exploitation of Africa. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next week.